I walked through the marble lobby of the luxury penthouse building in downtown Chicago, my heels clicking against the polished stone. The familiar scent of expensive flowers from the reception desk brought back memories I had tried to forget. My cousin Madison spotted me immediately. "Who let her in?" "She's like mold, keeps coming back," Madison announced loudly, her voice echoing through the elegant space. Her designer dress and perfectly styled hair screamed money, just like always. I didn't answer. I simply pressed the elevator button for the penthouse floor. Security came running across the lobby, their uniforms crisp and professional. But instead of escorting me out, they respectfully greeted me and moved toward Madison. "Ma'am, I'm going to need to ask you to come with me," the lead security guard said to Madison. Madison couldn't understand what just happened. The elevator rose silently toward the penthouse, each floor bringing back memories I had buried deep. 5 years ago, this building had been my home, though not in the way anyone might expect. I lived in apartment 312 with my grandmother Margaret, a modest 2-bedroom unit that felt like a palace compared to the cramped apartment I had shared with my father after my mother died. Margaret Morrison was the family matriarch, a woman who had built a successful chain of vintage jewelry stores from nothing. She started with a single shop in 1978, buying estate jewelry from wealthy families and restoring pieces to their former glory. By the time I was 25, she owned 3 locations throughout Chicago and had amassed a collection of rare antiques that made museum curators weep with envy. My cousins Madison and Trevor, along with their parents, had always assumed they would inherit everything. They came from what the family considered the successful branch. Madison's father, Uncle Robert, was a prominent corporate lawyer who drove a Mercedes and belonged to an exclusive country club. Trevor worked in finance at a prestigious firm downtown, making 6 figures before he turned 30. They lived in sprawling suburban homes with 3-car garages and took European vacations every summer. My branch of the family tree was different. My mother had died when I was 16, leaving my father to raise me on a school janitor's salary. We lived paycheck to paycheck in a small apartment on the south side, where the heat sometimes didn't work and the neighbors played music too loud. The wealthy relatives barely tolerated us at family gatherings, making polite conversation while their eyes said everything about what they really thought of us. When I graduated from Northwestern with a computer science degree, landing a job as a software engineer, my father was proud beyond words. I was making good money, enough to get my own place, but when grandmother Margaret's health began declining, I made a choice that would change everything. I moved in with her to help manage her daily needs and assist with the complex bookkeeping her jewelry business required. The arrangement worked beautifully at first. Margaret loved having company, and I enjoyed spending time with the woman who had always been my strongest supporter. She would tell me stories about building her business while I organized her financial records and helped modernize her inventory systems. We would cook dinner together and watch old movies, and for the first time since my mother died, I felt like I belonged somewhere. But the rest of the family saw something sinister in our closeness. They began dropping hints at holiday dinners, suggesting that I was taking advantage of an elderly woman. Madison would make comments about how convenient it was that I lived rent-free while they all struggled with mortgages. Trevor openly questioned whether Margaret was mentally competent enough to make financial decisions. The pressure started building 18 months after I moved in. Uncle Robert began visiting more frequently, always bringing paperwork for Margaret to sign. Aunt Susan would call daily, asking probing questions about Margaret's spending habits and medical appointments. They claimed they were worried about her welfare, but I could see the calculating look in their eyes every time they glanced at her antique collection or discussed the value of her real estate holdings. The breaking point came at Margaret's 85th birthday party, held in the penthouse that served as her private residence above her flagship jewelry store. The family had gathered to celebrate, but the evening quickly turned ugly when Uncle Robert stood up during dinner to make what he called an important announcement. "We've all been worried about Mother lately," he began, his lawyer's voice carrying the authority he used in courtrooms. "Her memory isn't what it used to be, and we're concerned that certain people might be taking advantage of her generous nature." The room fell silent except for the soft jazz playing from Margaret's vintage stereo system. I felt every eye in the room turn toward me, and my stomach dropped as I realized what was happening. Madison picked up where her father left off. "Grandmother, we love you, but we think Helene has been manipulating you." She moved in here and suddenly you're changing banks, updating your will, giving her access to your business accounts. It's textbook elder abuse. Trevor nodded gravely. We've done research on this kind of thing. Predatory family members who isolate elderly relatives and gradually gain control of their finances. The patterns are all there. I sat frozen as they presented their case against me. They claimed I had convinced Margaret to change banks to accounts they couldn't monitor. They said I was preventing them from visiting by scheduling too many medical appointments. They produced a folder of printouts about financial elder abuse and pointed out how every warning sign applied to our situation. Margaret sat at the head of the table, her hands trembling slightly as she processed the accusations flying around her dining room. At 85, she was still sharp as a tack, but the emotional weight of her children and grandchildren attacking each other in her home was taking its toll. "You're like a parasite," Madison said directly to me, her voice rising with emotion. "You came here because you couldn't make it on your own, and now you're bleeding our grandmother dry. You're nothing but a gold digger and a charity case who doesn't belong in this family." Uncle Robert delivered the final blow. "Mother, we're asking you to choose. Either Helene leaves and we handle your care properly, or we'll be forced to take legal action to protect you. We've already consulted with an attorney about guardianship proceedings." The threat hung in the air like smoke. I looked at Margaret, hoping she would defend me, tell them how I had never asked for anything, how I genuinely cared about her well-being. But she looked so small and fragile, overwhelmed by the conflict tearing her family apart. "Helene, dear," Margaret said quietly, her voice barely audible above the sound of my heart breaking. "Perhaps it would be best if you found your own place, just until this all settles down." I felt like I had been physically punched. The woman I had cared for, cooked for, laughed with, and loved like a second mother was asking me to leave, based on the lies and manipulation of family members who saw her as nothing more than a bank account with a pulse. I stood up slowly, placing my napkin on the table with as much dignity as I could muster. "I understand," I said, though my voice cracked on the words. "I'll pack tonight." Madison looked triumphant. Trevor actually smiled. Uncle Robert nodded with satisfaction, as if he had just won a particularly challenging case. "Helene," Margaret called as I reached the dining room doorway. "You know I love you, don't you?" I turned back to look at her one last time, this woman who had given me a sense of belonging and then taken it away. "I know you do, grandmother, and I love you too. That's why I'm leaving." I packed a single suitcase that night, taking only my clothes and a few personal items. I left behind the key to her apartment, the credit card she had given me for household expenses, and the sense of family I thought I had finally found. I moved into a small studio apartment across town and threw myself into my work, determined to prove that I was more than the worthless charity case my cousins had painted me as. Margaret died 8 months later. I found out from an obituary in the Chicago Tribune, since none of the family bothered to inform me. I attended the funeral from the back of the church, watching from a distance as the relatives who had driven me away mourned the woman they had claimed to protect. I never spoke to Margaret again after that birthday dinner. The regret of that silence would haunt me for years, but I had made a promise to myself the night I left her penthouse. I would become successful enough that they could never call me a charity case again. The elevator doors opened directly into Margaret's penthouse, and I stepped into a scene that felt like a nightmare replay of that terrible birthday dinner 5 years ago. The familiar warmth of Margaret's home hit me immediately. The scent of her favorite lavender candles, the soft lighting from her antique lamps, the gentle hum of classical music from her sound system that someone had apparently left running. But the penthouse was filled with people who had no business being there. 15 family members were gathered around Margaret's antique mahogany dining table, the same table where they had destroyed my life half a decade earlier. They were dressed in formal black attire, and legal documents were spread across the polished surface. A man in an expensive suit sat at the head of the table with an open briefcase beside him. Madison spotted me first, her face cycling through confusion, recognition, and then pure outrage in the span of 3 seconds. "Are you kidding me right now? How did you even get up here? The doorman should have stopped you," she snapped, rising from her chair so quickly that it scraped against the hardwood floor. Her designer black dress probably cost more than most people made in a month, and her jewelry caught the light from the chandelier as she gestured dramatically. Trevor immediately pulled out his phone with the smooth efficiency of someone accustomed to handling problems with money and connections. "We have an intruder in Penthouse A," he said into the device. "Send security up immediately." Uncle Robert stood up slowly, his face turning the same shade of red it had reached during my public humiliation years earlier. He had aged since I last saw him, more gray in his hair, deeper lines around his eyes, but the same authoritative bearing that had intimidated me when I was younger. "Helene, you have some nerve showing up here today, of all days. This is a private family matter." His voice carried the same courtroom authority he had used to destroy my reputation. "You made your choice when you tried to steal from Mother, and now you think you can just waltz back in here like nothing happened?" Aunt Susan, Uncle Robert's wife, added her voice to the chorus of outrage. "Margaret's will reading is for actual family only. You know, the people who actually cared about her and visited her regularly instead of abandoning her when things got difficult." I realized with a shock that this gathering was the reading of Margaret's will. Nobody had informed me that she had even passed away, let alone invited me to this final distribution of her worldly possessions. The lawyer at the head of the table looked distinctly uncomfortable, shuffling his papers and glancing between me and the hostile family members. "Perhaps we should wait until security handles this situation before proceeding," he suggested diplomatically. But the family was just getting started. Madison launched into a detailed character assassination, her voice rising with each accusation. "You manipulated a sick old woman and then disappeared when she needed you most. You have no right to be here, no right to interrupt our grieving process, and certainly no claim to anything that belonged to our grandmother." Trevor nodded along enthusiastically. "We all know what you did. You convinced her to change her bank accounts, isolated her from the family, made her paranoid about our intentions. Classic financial abuse tactics." The stories started flowing then, each family member contributing their own version of my supposed crimes. Madison claimed I had stolen several pieces of vintage jewelry, including a diamond necklace that had belonged to Margaret's mother. Trevor insisted I had forged checks and convinced Margaret to give me power of attorney. Aunt Susan described how I had supposedly prevented family members from visiting by claiming Margaret was too sick or tired for company. Uncle Robert produced a folder thick with documents. "We have evidence of everything. Bank records showing suspicious transfers, witness statements from neighbors who saw you loading boxes into your car, even photos of missing antiques." The lies built upon each other like a house of cards, each story more elaborate than the last. They painted a picture of me as a calculating predator who had wormed her way into an elderly woman's life for financial gain. The worst part was how genuinely convinced they seemed by their own narrative. They had told these stories so many times that they probably believed them themselves. "She disappeared for 5 years, Madison continued, her voice thick with manufactured emotion. 5 years! While we took care of funeral arrangements, settled her affairs, dealt with the grief of losing the most important woman in our lives, and now she shows up at the will reading expecting what? A handout? Sympathy?" The security guards arrived then, 2 men in crisp uniforms who clearly knew the building well. But something strange happened when they entered the penthouse. The lead guard, a Hispanic man with Carlos on his name tag, looked directly at me and his expression changed completely. "Ma'am," he said respectfully, inclining his head slightly, "I apologize for the disturbance. How would you like us to handle this situation?" The room fell silent at his deferential tone. Madison's mouth actually dropped open. Trevor lowered his phone slowly, confusion written across his features. Uncle Robert recovered first, his lawyer instincts kicking in. "Officer, this woman has a history of elder abuse and financial crimes against our grandmother. She's clearly here to steal something or disrupt our legal proceedings." Carlos looked from Uncle Robert back to me, waiting for direction. His partner, a younger guard whose name tag read Johnson, stood slightly behind him with the same respectful posture. "There's been no crime committed here," Carlos said carefully. "Perhaps everyone should remain calm while we sort this out." The family began talking over each other, each voice trying to be heard above the chaos. Madison demanded that I be arrested immediately. Trevor waved his phone, threatening to call the police. Aunt Susan began sobbing dramatically about how traumatic this was for everyone involved. But I noticed something they missed entirely. The security guards weren't treating me like an intruder or a criminal. They were treating me like someone who belonged there. I remained silent through the entire ordeal, watching the people who had once called themselves my family reveal their true nature to a room full of witnesses. The lawyer was taking notes, I noticed, scribbling furiously as each family member made increasingly wild accusations. Finally, Uncle Robert turned back to the lawyer with exasperation. "Mr. Davidson, surely you can see that this woman has no business being here. She was explicitly excluded from Mother's will for good reason. We made sure of that." Mr. Davidson cleared his throat nervously. "Actually, there are some unusual provisions in Mrs. Morrison's final will that specifically mention." "She has no legal right to anything," Uncle Robert interrupted with the confidence of a man accustomed to being the smartest person in the room. "We made absolutely certain that she couldn't manipulate her way back into the estate." Carlos leaned over and whispered something in my ear that made my heart race. "Ma'am, should we escort them out now?" The question hung in the air like a challenge. Madison noticed the guard's tone immediately, her confidence wavering for the first time since I had walked through the door. "Why is he talking to you like that?" she demanded, but her voice had lost some of its earlier venom. I looked around the room at their confused faces, at the lawyer who was trying desperately to regain control of the proceedings, at the antique furniture and artwork that had once made this place feel like home. "Mr. Davidson," I said calmly, "perhaps you should proceed with the reading." Madison stood up with theatrical drama, pointing at me like a prosecutor delivering closing arguments to a jury. Her voice carried across the penthouse, with the kind of authority she had learned from watching her father in courtrooms. "Officer, this woman has a documented history of elder abuse and financial crimes against our grandmother. She's clearly here to steal something or intimidate our family during this difficult time." Trevor held up his phone like evidence in a trial. "I'm calling the police right now. This is breaking and entering, harassment, and probably violation of a restraining order." I had to bite back a laugh at that last part. There had never been a restraining order, but Trevor had always been creative with the truth when it served his purposes. The security guard, Carlos, looked increasingly uncomfortable as the family's accusations grew more heated. "Ma'am, perhaps there's been some kind of misunderstanding here." Uncle Robert cut him off with the imperious wave of a hand. "No misunderstanding whatsoever. This woman was cut off from our family years ago for good reason. She manipulated our mother, a vulnerable elderly woman, into giving her money and tried to turn her against her own children." The family began presenting what they called evidence, spreading documents across Margaret's dining table like prosecutors laying out a case. Madison pulled out her phone and showed photos of various pieces of jewelry. "These are family heirlooms that she stole from our grandmother's personal collection," Madison announced, swiping through image after image. "This pearl necklace belonged to my great-grandmother. This diamond bracelet was a wedding gift from my great-grandfather. She convinced our grandmother to give them to her, but we all know it was theft." Trevor opened his laptop and pulled up bank statements, though I noticed he was careful not to let anyone see the actual numbers. "Here's proof of financial manipulation. Look at these account transfers that happened right after she moved in. Thousands of dollars moved to accounts that grandmother had never used before." Aunt Susan dabbed at her eyes with a tissue, playing the role of grieving daughter to perfection. She isolated our mother from us. Whenever we tried to visit, she would claim that mother was too tired or too sick to see us. She was systematically cutting us off from our own family. The accusations kept coming, each one more elaborate than the last. They claimed I had convinced Margaret to change her locks so family members couldn't visit unexpectedly. They said I had intercepted mail and phone calls to control Margaret's communications with the outside world. Trevor even suggested that I had been drugging Margaret to keep her compliant and confused. But then Aunt Susan let slip something that revealed the true scope of their greed and their efficiency in dismantling Margaret's legacy. "At least we were able to handle Mother's business affairs properly after she passed," she said with pride. "We sold all 3 jewelry stores to Harrison Corporation immediately after the funeral. Got $4.2 million total, which was actually quite good considering the market conditions." Uncle Robert nodded approvingly. "We've been very efficient in liquidating the estate. Mother's antique collection went to auction through Sotheby's and brought in another $800,000. The family cottage up in Michigan sold last month for $600,000. Trevor pulled up more documents on his laptop. We've liquidated almost everything except this penthouse, which we're planning to sell once the will is finalized. The real estate agent thinks we can get at least $2.8 million for it, maybe $3 million if we stage it properly. Madison beamed with satisfaction. We've been working with estate planners and financial advisors to make sure every asset is properly distributed according to grandmother's wishes. Unlike certain people, we actually take our family responsibilities seriously. The lawyer, Mr. Davidson, kept trying to interrupt their presentation, but the family talked over him with the enthusiasm of people who believed they had already won. Uncle Robert turned back to the security guards with growing impatience. "Gentlemen, I think it's clear that this woman needs to be escorted from the building immediately. We're trying to conduct important legal business here, and her presence is both inappropriate and potentially criminal." Carlos looked at his partner Johnson, who seemed equally confused by the dynamics playing out in front of them. "Sir, perhaps we should wait for—" "No waiting," Madison interrupted. "We want her removed now. She's trespassing on private property and interfering with legal proceedings." Trevor waved his phone again. "The police are on their way. We're going to have her arrested for breaking and entering, and then we're going to pursue a civil case for the emotional distress she's causing our family." I had remained silent through their entire performance, letting them dig their own graves with every word. The lawyer was scribbling notes furiously, and I could see the mounting concern in his expression as the family revealed just how thoroughly they had already divided up Margaret's estate. Finally, I spoke for the first time since entering the penthouse. "I'm not here to steal anything." My calm voice cut through their hysteria like a knife, and the room fell silent. They had worked themselves into such a frenzy that my quiet words seemed to carry more weight than all their shouting combined. Madison laughed, but it sounded forced and slightly hysterical. "Right. You just happened to break into our grandmother's penthouse on the exact day we're reading her will. What a convenient coincidence." "I didn't break in," I said simply. Uncle Robert's face was turning purple with rage. "Don't try to play word games with us. We know exactly what kind of person you are. You're a manipulative, greedy little parasite who preys on elderly people, and you're not getting another penny from this family." Carlos cleared his throat gently. "Excuse me, sir, but perhaps you should lower your voice. This is a residential building, and we need to be mindful of the other tenants." Something in his tone made Madison look at him more closely. "Why do you care about noise complaints? We're family members settling our grandmother's estate. This is our business." Johnson, the younger security guard, stepped forward slightly. "Ma'am, we just want to make sure everyone remains calm and respectful while this situation gets resolved." Trevor snapped his laptop closed with frustration. "What situation?" "The situation is that this woman is trespassing and needs to be arrested." "How hard is that to understand?" I watched their confusion grow as they noticed the guard's continued deference toward me. Madison kept glancing between Carlos and me, trying to understand why he wasn't immediately following their demands. "Why won't you just remove her?" Madison demanded, her voice rising to near hysteria. "We've told you she doesn't belong here. We've explained that she's a criminal who stole from our family. Why are you treating her like she has some right to be in our grandmother's home?" The word "our" hung in the air, and I saw Mr. Davidson wince slightly at Madison's possessive language. Finally, I decided it was time to begin revealing the truth. "This isn't your grandmother's home anymore," I said quietly. The silence that followed my words was so complete, I could hear the antique grandfather clock in Margaret's hallway marking the seconds. Uncle Robert was the first to find his voice. "What exactly is that supposed to mean?" I reached into my purse and removed a business card, placing it gently on the mahogany table where so many family dinners had taken place. The simple white card looked insignificant against the dark wood, but I knew the words printed on it would change everything. Uncle Robert picked up the card and read aloud in a mocking tone, "Helene Morrison, Founder and Chief Executive Officer, Secure Data Solutions." He looked up at me with contempt. "What kind of made-up company is this? Some kind of cleaning service?" "The kind that was acquired by Microsoft for $47 million last month," I replied calmly. The words hit the room like a physical force. Madison's face went completely white. Trevor actually stumbled backward into his chair. Aunt Susan's tissue froze halfway to her eyes. Madison snatched the business card from her father's hand, staring at it like it might burst into flames. "That's impossible. You were living with grandmother because you couldn't afford your own place. You were working some entry-level job and barely making ends meet. I pulled out my phone and navigated to the recent news articles I had bookmarked for exactly this moment. Chicago tech startup Secure Data Solutions acquired by Microsoft for record sum, I read from the first headline. Local entrepreneur Helene Morrison named to Forbes 30 Under 30 list. Former janitor's daughter builds multi-million-dollar software empire. I handed the phone to Trevor, who scrolled through article after article with growing disbelief. His background in finance made him understand the numbers faster than the others, and I watched his face change as the reality of what he was reading sank in. "This can't be real," he whispered, but his voice lacked conviction. The articles told the story of my journey since leaving Margaret's penthouse 5 years ago. How I had started Secure Data Solutions 18 months after our family confrontation, working 16-hour days in a cramped studio apartment, writing code that would revolutionize small business cybersecurity. I started the company with 3 employees, I explained, my voice steady despite the earthquake I was creating in their assumptions. 2 programmers I had worked with at my previous job, and 1 business manager we hired part-time. We focused on data security software for small and medium-sized businesses, companies that couldn't afford enterprise-level protection but desperately needed it. Uncle Robert was reading over Trevor's shoulder now, his lawyer's mind trying to process this information and find some angle to discredit it. We grew from 3 employees to 50, 7 over 4 years, I continued. We hold 6 patents on encryption technology that prevents 98% of the most common cyber attacks targeting small businesses. Our software is used by over 12,000 companies across North America. Madison's voice cracked when she finally found words. But you were living here because you couldn't afford your own apartment. You were poor. You needed our grandmother's charity. I looked at her with something that might have been pity. Madison, I was making $85,000 a year as a software engineer before I moved in with Margaret. I had enough saved for a down payment on a condo. I could have afforded my own place easily. The room spun with their confusion as everything they thought they knew about me crumbled. Then why? Aunt Susan began, but couldn't finish the question. Why did I live with Margaret? Because she called me one evening and told me she was lonely. Because she said the penthouse felt too big and empty after grandfather died. Because I loved spending time with the one person in this family who never made me feel like I wasn't good enough. Trevor was still scrolling through my phone, finding more articles, more photos of me at industry conferences and award ceremonies. If you were making this much money, why did you care about grandmother's will? Why did any of the family financial stuff matter? It didn't matter to me financially. It mattered because I loved her, and I thought she loved me too. I paused, letting that sink in. I was working a demanding job and building a business plan for my startup, but I still made time to have dinner with Margaret every night. I helped her organize her jewelry inventory, not because I wanted to steal from her, but because I enjoyed hearing her stories about each piece. Madison was shaking her head in denial. No. This doesn't make sense. If you were so successful, why are you here? Why do you care about some old woman's will reading? Mr. Davidson finally managed to speak up. Actually, that's exactly why we're here today. There are some very unusual provisions in Mrs. Pronis, Margaret Morrison's final will that specifically mention. Uncle Robert cut him off again, but his voice had lost its earlier authority. She was explicitly excluded from any inheritance. We made sure of that after we discovered her manipulation and abuse. Carlos, who had been watching this entire exchange with growing interest, stepped forward slightly. "Ma'am, should we escort them out now?" The question hung in the air like a challenge, and I saw the exact moment when Madison finally heard what he was really asking. Her eyes widened as she processed the security guard's deferential tone, the way he was looking to me for direction instead of following their demands. "Why does he keep asking you that?" Madison whispered, but her voice was no longer angry. Now it was scared. I didn't answer immediately. Instead, I looked around the penthouse that had once been my sanctuary, at the family members who had driven me away with their cruelty and greed, at the lawyer who was desperately trying to regain control of a situation that was spiraling beyond everyone's expectations. "Mr. Davidson," I said finally, I think it's time you proceeded with the reading of Margaret's will." Uncle Robert made one last attempt to assert control. "Now wait just a minute. I don't care how much money she claims to have made. The will was clear, and she has no legal standing here." But I could see doubt creeping into his expression, the first crack in the foundation of certainty he had built his case upon. Trevor closed my phone and handed it back to me with trembling fingers. "Helene, if all of this is true, why didn't you ever tell us? Why did you let us think?" "Let you think what, Trevor? Let you think I was poor? Let you think I was desperate? You never asked about my life or my work. You just assumed that because my father was a janitor, I must be worthless too." The truth hung between us like a wall, and I could see each of them beginning to understand that everything they thought they knew about the past 5 years was built on assumptions and prejudices they had never bothered to question. Mr. Davidson opened his briefcase with hands that were visibly trembling. The leather case was old and expensive, the kind that spoke of decades spent handling the final wishes of Chicago's wealthy families. But I could tell by his expression that he had never handled a situation quite like this one. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began in a voice that struggled to maintain professional composure, "perhaps we should start over with the formal reading of Mrs. Margaret Elizabeth Morrison's last will and testament." Uncle Robert's face was still red with indignation, but I could see uncertainty creeping into his eyes. "We already know the contents of the will. Everything was divided equally among mother's children and grandchildren, with explicit exclusions for certain individuals who had proven themselves unworthy." Mr. Davidson pulled out a thick document bound in blue legal backing. "Actually, sir, that was Mrs. Morrison's previous will from 2 years ago. This is her final will and testament, dated and witnessed 6 months before her death. She made some very significant changes." The room went silent except for the sound of papers rustling as Mr. Davidson found his place in the document. Madison gripped the edge of the dining table so tightly her knuckles went white. "I, Margaret Elizabeth Morrison, being of sound mind and body, do hereby revoke all previous wills and testaments and declare this to be my final will, Mr." Davidson's voice carried clearly through the penthouse as he read the legal formalities. Then he reached the substance of the document, and his voice took on an almost apologetic tone. "I hereby bequeath my entire estate, including all real property, personal property, business interests, investments, and financial accounts, to my granddaughter Helene Marie Morrison." The room exploded. Madison's scream cut through the air like a siren. "That's impossible! She was manipulated. Grandmother wasn't mentally competent." Trevor lunged forward as if he could physically stop the words from being read. "This is fraud! This document is fake! She was completely excluded from any inheritance." But Mr. Davidson continued reading over the chaos, his voice growing stronger as he realized there was no stopping the truth from coming out. "Whom I wrongfully allowed to be driven from our family by the greed and jealousy of relatives who cared more about my money than my happiness." Uncle Robert was on his feet now, his face purple with rage. "Stop reading that fabrication. My mother would never. She couldn't. We had her examined by doctors, including all real estate properties currently owned by my estate, specifically including the penthouse residence located at 1200 North Lake Shore Drive, Unit A, where this reading is taking place." The words hit like physical blows. Aunt Susan actually fainted, her body crumpling onto Margaret's antique sofa in a dramatic heap that would have been comical under different circumstances. Madison was sobbing hysterically now, her perfect makeup streaming down her cheeks in black rivers. "You're sitting in our inheritance! This is our home! Our grandmother's legacy!" But Mr. Davidson wasn't finished. He pulled out a sealed envelope and opened it carefully. Mrs. Morrison also left detailed letters explaining her decision, which I'm authorized to read aloud. He cleared his throat and began, quote, "My family showed their true nature when they attacked the one person who loved me without wanting anything in return. Helene cared for me, worked alongside me, and brought joy to my final years not because she expected financial reward, but because she genuinely enjoyed my company." Trevor was pacing now like a caged animal, pulling at his hair with both hands. "This is insane! She was senile! She didn't understand what she was doing." Mr. Davidson continued reading Margaret's words. When my children and grandchildren demanded that I choose between Helene and family peace, they revealed themselves to be exactly what I feared they were. People who saw me as nothing more than a bank account with a pulse. Helene left quietly without demanding anything or fighting back, proving the purity of her intentions. Uncle Robert was frantically pulling out his phone. "I'm calling our attorney right now. This will can be contested on grounds of mental incapacity and undue influence." "The will continues," Mr. Davidson said, raising his voice above the chaos. Quote, "I secretly remained in contact with Helene through my attorney following her departure. I followed her remarkable business success with immense pride, watching her build a technology company that has achieved recognition throughout the industry. She accomplished all of this without asking me for a single penny or using any family connections." Madison looked up from her sobbing, mascara streaking her face. "Remained in contact? What does that mean?" Mr. Davidson pulled out another document. Mrs. Morrison hired a private investigator to monitor both Helene's progress and her family's behavior following Helene's departure. She has extensive documentation of everything that occurred over the past 5 years. The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Trevor stopped pacing. Uncle Robert's phone calls suddenly didn't seem as urgent. "Furthermore," Mr. Davidson continued, Mrs. Morrison was very specific about her reasoning. Quote, "Helene is the only family member who ever loved me for myself rather than my possessions. She is the heir I choose, and I trust her to use this inheritance wisely and generously, as I was never able to trust my other relatives." Trevor's voice came out as barely a whisper. "The building? Excuse me?" she said, "including all real estate properties. Does that mean just the penthouse, or—" I stood up slowly, feeling the weight of 5 years of pain and struggle settling into a kind of peaceful resolution. "Margaret bought this entire building 5 years ago as an investment property," I said calmly. "She converted the ground floor into her flagship jewelry store and moved into the penthouse above it. When she died, I inherited everything." Uncle Robert's voice cracked completely. "The entire building? All 15 floors. The jewelry store, the restaurant on the 2nd floor, the office spaces, the residential units." I looked around the room at their stunned faces. "You've all been paying rent to my property management company for the past year without realizing it." The silence that followed was broken only by Aunt Susan's muffled sobbing and the steady ticking of Margaret's antique clock. Madison whispered, "We sold her businesses." "Yes," I said. "Businesses that were no longer yours to sell." I walked to Margaret's antique secretary desk, a beautiful piece from the 1800s that she had restored herself decades ago. The wood still gleamed with the care she had put into every detail of her home. From the bottom drawer, I pulled out a thick manila folder that I had placed there earlier. Madison stopped crying long enough to stare. "What are those files?" "Margaret left me more than just money and property," I said, spreading photographs and documents across the dining table like a prosecutor laying out evidence. "She also left me her private investigator's files." The family members leaned forward despite themselves, drawn by a mixture of curiosity and dread. Margaret hired a private investigator 6 months before she died. She suspected someone had been stealing from her jewelry stores, and she wanted documentation before confronting anyone. I placed a series of security camera photographs on the table. She was right. Trevor's face went completely white as he recognized himself in the images. The photos showed him at the register of Margaret's flagship store, his hands in the cash drawer when no customers were present. "Trevor, you embezzled $15,437 from the store registers over 18 months, I said matter-of-factly. The investigator documented every incident. Timestamps, security footage, bank records showing when you made deposits to your personal account. Trevor tried to speak, but only managed a choking sound. Madison looked at the photos with growing horror. "Trevor, what did you do?" "I was managing cash flow," he stammered. "The stores needed better financial oversight, and I was helping with." I placed another set of photos on the table. "Madison, you took 12 pieces of estate jewelry from Margaret's personal collection and sold them through online auction sites, including her mother's wedding ring." The photos showed Madison in Margaret's bedroom, carefully removing jewelry from the antique armoire where Margaret kept her most precious pieces. Other images showed the same jewelry listed for sale on various auction websites. Madison's voice was barely a whisper. Those were gifts. She gave them to me. The investigator has serial numbers for every piece, sales records from the auction sites, and bank records showing the deposits to your account. Total value, $28,000. I spread out more documents, each one more damaging than the last. Bank statements, email communications, even recordings from phone conversations. But here's the most interesting discovery, I continued, pulling out a thick legal document. When you sold Margaret's 3 jewelry stores to Harrison Corporation, you committed federal fraud. Uncle Robert found his voice. What fraud? We were the legal heirs to the business. We had every right to liquidate her assets. Actually, you didn't own those businesses. I placed a property transfer document on the table, notarized and witnessed. Margaret transferred ownership of all 3 stores to me 3 months before she died. The private investigator documented the entire process. The room was so quiet I could hear my own heartbeat. Aunt Susan had stopped crying and was staring at the document with the expression of someone watching their world collapse. You sold $42 million worth of commercial real estate and established business goodwill for $4.2 million to Harrison Corporation, I continued. They paid you that amount because they assumed you didn't understand the true value of what you were selling. Uncle Robert's voice was hollow. $4.2 million was a fair price. We had 3 independent appraisals. I placed another document on the table. Harrison Corporation has already listed the flagship store property for $18 million. They're converting the other 2 locations into luxury condominiums with projected values of $15 million each. They bought nearly $50 million in assets from you for less than 10 cents on the dollar. Trevor was hyperventilating now, his hands shaking as he stared at the evidence of his crimes spread across his grandmother's dining table. So you see, I said calmly, not only did you steal from me by selling property that belonged to me, you were spectacularly incompetent about it. You cost yourselves $38 million through sheer ignorance and greed. Madison's voice came out as a broken whisper. We didn't know. You didn't know because you never bothered to have the properties properly appraised. You saw $4.2 million and thought you'd hit the lottery. You were so eager to cash out and divide the money that you never stopped to consider whether you were being taken advantage of. I pulled out another folder, this one even thicker than the first. I've spent the past year working with federal investigators and attorneys to build cases against everyone involved in the illegal sales. Every family member who participated in liquidating assets that didn't belong to them faces criminal charges for fraud, conspiracy, and theft. Uncle Robert tried to stand, but his legs wouldn't support him. You can't. We're family. We didn't know. You stopped being my family when you called me a parasite and a gold digger in this very room 5 years ago, when you convinced Margaret to choose between me and family peace. When you celebrated at her funeral because you thought you'd finally gotten rid of the poor relation. I walked to the window overlooking Lake Michigan, the same view Margaret had loved so much. The late afternoon sun was painting the water gold, and I could see sailboats in the distance enjoying the perfect Chicago weather. I know exactly what each of you said about me after I left. The investigator recorded your conversations at family gatherings, your phone calls to each other, your meetings with lawyers to make sure I could never manipulate my way back into the estate. The evidence kept mounting. Phone recordings of Madison laughing about how they'd finally gotten rid of the charity case. Bank records showing how quickly they'd spent Margaret's money on luxury vacations and new cars. Email chains discussing strategies to keep me permanently excluded from the family. But I'm not completely heartless, I said, turning back to face them. Despite everything you've done, I'm going to offer you a choice. The room held its collective breath. Option 1, full criminal prosecution, federal fraud charges that carry sentences of 5 to 10 years in prison. Public trials where every newspaper in Chicago will cover the story of how Margaret Morrison's own family stole her legacy. Your children will read about your crimes in the Tribune. Madison whimpered. Option 2. You make this right. You return every penny you made from the illegal sales, plus interest and penalties. You publicly acknowledge your theft and apologize for your treatment of both Margaret and me. You accept that I am the rightful owner of what Margaret left me. And then you disappear from my life forever. Trevor's voice cracked like a teenager's. The money's already spent. Then you'll figure out how to spend it, sell your houses, liquidate your retirement accounts, take out second mortgages, borrow against your life insurance. I don't care how you raise the money, but every dollar comes back to me within 90 days, or I press charges. I pulled out one final document and placed it in front of Uncle Robert. This is a confession and restitution agreement. Sign it, and you have 3 months to return $4.6 million, including interest and penalties for the illegal sale of my property. Uncle Robert stared at the document like it was a death sentence. Helene, please. We made mistakes, but we're still family. I looked around the room at their tear-stained, desperate faces, these people who had driven me away with such confidence and cruelty 5 years ago. You made your choice about family 5 years ago, I said. Now I'm making mine. 6 months later, I sat in Margaret's favorite armchair in the penthouse living room, watching the sun set over Lake Michigan through the floor, 2 ceiling windows. The space had been redecorated, warmer colors, more modern furniture, but still honoring the elegant taste that had made this place feel like a sanctuary. Fresh flowers from the building's garden filled crystal vases on every table, and the scent of Margaret's favorite lavender candles still drifted through the rooms. Carlos knocked gently on the penthouse door before entering with my evening coffee, a ritual we had established over the past few months. His security uniform had been replaced with the more casual attire of a building manager, a promotion I had offered him after discovering his MBA degree and his genuine care for the residents. The new tenants for Unit 12B are moving in today, Miss Morrison, he said, setting the coffee on the antique side table that Margaret had restored herself decades ago. The Henderson family seems lovely. Their daughter just started Northwestern, studying computer science. I smiled, remembering my own college days and the dreams I had carried about making a difference in the world through technology. Thank you, Carlos. I appreciate everything you do to make this building feel like home for everyone who lives here. After Carlos left, I reflected on how dramatically my life had changed since that confrontation in this very room. Every family member had chosen option 2, returning the money rather than facing criminal prosecution. The process had taken the full 6 months, requiring them to liquidate assets, take out loans, and make drastic changes to their lifestyles, but they had managed to return every penny, plus the interest and penalties I had demanded. Uncle Robert had been forced to sell his vacation home in Aspen and his vintage Mercedes. The proceeds, combined with a second mortgage on his primary residence, had covered his portion of the restitution. Trevor had sold his BMW, moved from his luxury apartment to a modest studio, and taken a second job delivering food on weekends to help pay off his family's debt. Madison had moved back into her parents' house, taken a retail position at a jewelry store downtown, and sold her designer wardrobe to contribute to the family's restitution fund. Aunt Susan had liquidated her extensive jewelry collection, canceled her country club membership, and taken a part-time job as a receptionist to help with expenses. The woman who had once looked down on my father's job as a janitor was now cleaning houses for wealthy families to make ends meet. But something remarkable had happened during those 6 months of struggle. Stripped of their wealth and forced to work together to solve their crisis, the family had begun communicating honestly for the first time in years. The shared hardship had forced them to confront their values and behavior in ways that comfort and privilege never could. 3 weeks ago, Madison had sent me a handwritten letter, not a request for forgiveness or mercy, but a genuine acknowledgement of the pain she had caused. Dear Helene, the letter began, I realize now that my jealousy of your relationship with grandmother Margaret made me cruel beyond belief. You were the only one who truly cared for her happiness, instead of her money, and I was too selfish and insecure to see that. I'm ashamed of who I became during those family meetings, and I'm working every day to be the person grandmother would have wanted me to be. Trevor had followed with his own letter a few days later, this one typed on simple computer paper instead of the expensive stationery he used to favor. I want to explain my theft, not to excuse it, but to help you understand how I lost my way. I was living beyond my means, trying to maintain an image of success that my salary couldn't support. I told myself I was just borrowing from the family business, that I would pay it back when my investments paid off. But I was lying to myself, You had every right to prosecute me for what I did. Your mercy gave me a chance to rebuild my character instead of just my bank account. Even Uncle Robert had written, his lawyer's prose unable to hide the genuine emotion behind his words. I led our family's attack on you because I was terrified of not being important anymore. In my mind, you represented a threat to the natural order where the successful members of the family controlled the legacy. I made you the enemy because I couldn't face the possibility that my mother might love someone else more than she loved me. Margaret raised us to be better than that, and I failed her memory in the worst possible way. I hadn't responded to any of the letters yet, but I hadn't thrown them away either. They sat in a folder on Margaret's desk, proof that even people who had behaved terribly could find their way back to basic human decency when circumstances demanded growth. The penthouse doorbell rang, interrupting my thoughts. I opened the door to find a young woman about 19 years old, with Trevor's distinctive nose and cheekbones, but Margaret's kind eyes and gentle smile. Aunt Helene? I'm Sophie, Trevor's daughter. I hope it's okay that I came to see you. I invited her into the living room, noting how she looked around the penthouse with wonder rather than calculation. This was the first time I had met Sophie, and I was struck by how different she seemed from the rest of the family. I wanted to meet you because my dad told me everything that happened, Sophie said, perching nervously on the edge of the sofa. The stealing, the lies, how badly everyone treated you. I'm so ashamed of my family. Sophie, you weren't responsible for their choices. But I benefited from them. Dad paid my college tuition with money he stole from your business. I'm transferring to a community college next semester and getting a job to pay you back myself. I studied this young woman who reminded me so much of Margaret's moral clarity and strength of character. What are you studying? Computer science. I want to build applications that help people manage their finances better, so they don't make the terrible mistakes my family made. Sophie's voice grew stronger as she talked about her goals. I want to create tools that teach financial literacy and help working-class families build wealth the right way. For the first time in months, I felt my heart begin to soften toward the Morrison family name. Here was someone who understood that redemption required more than just returning stolen money. It demanded using the experience to create something better. Sophie, I don't want you to pay me back for your father's mistakes, but I have a different proposition for you. Thank you for listening to my story, and I hope it encourages you to believe in your own potential, even when the people closest to you struggle to see it. Sometimes the most important validation is the kind you give yourself, and sometimes the best family relationships are the ones you rebuild on foundations of mutual respect and genuine care. Remember, you're worth more than other people's limited perception of your potential. Keep building, keep growing, and keep believing in yourself, even when others can't see your vision yet. The success you create might surprise everyone, including yourself. I walked to the window overlooking the city, thinking about all the young people out there who deserved the same chances I had been given. I want to hire you as our first student coordinator. Full-time position with competitive salary, tuition assistance for finishing your degree at Northwestern, and direct mentorship in nonprofit management and technology development. Sophie started crying, but these were tears of relief and gratitude rather than despair. Why would you help me after what my family did to you? Because Margaret taught me that family isn't just about blood relationships, it's about choosing to love and support each other. Your family made terrible choices, but you're choosing differently. That's exactly what Margaret would want me to honor and encourage. I realized in that moment that my greatest victory wasn't the money or property I had reclaimed. It was breaking the cycle of greed and resentment that had poisoned the Morrison family for decades. By offering Sophie a path forward based on merit and character rather than family connections, I was creating the kind of legacy Margaret would have been proud of. Besides, I added with the first genuine smile I had felt in months, Margaret always said that the best revenge is massive success that lifts others up with you. Over the following months, the Margaret Morrison Foundation grew beyond my wildest expectations. We awarded scholarships to 47 students in our first year and provided funding for 12 small business startups led by young entrepreneurs from working-class backgrounds. Sophie graduated summa cum laude and developed a mobile app that helped families track expenses and build emergency savings. Her success story became our foundation's first case study in how talent and opportunity could transform lives. The changes in my extended family continued to surprise me. Trevor had genuinely transformed his relationship with money and work, becoming a financial counselor who specialized in helping families recover from debt and financial mistakes. His own experience with theft and restitution gave him credibility with clients that no amount of formal training could have provided. Madison started a small jewelry design business, creating affordable pieces for young professionals. She donated 10% of her profits to the foundation and had developed a reputation for honest dealing that would have made Margaret proud. Her struggle to rebuild her life from scratch had taught her the value of genuine accomplishment over inherited privilege. Uncle Robert and Aunt Susan had moved to a modest retirement community in Florida, where they volunteered at a literacy program and finally learned to find happiness in simple pleasures rather than status symbols. Robert used his legal skills to provide pro bono services for elderly residents who couldn't afford attorneys, discovering a sense of purpose he had never found in corporate law. The family dynamics had shifted completely. We still rarely spoke, but when we did interact at holidays or family milestones, the conversations were honest and respectful. They had earned their way back to being decent people, even if we would never again be close. Margaret's penthouse had become more than just my home. It was the headquarters for a legacy of opportunity and growth. Every week, young people walked through these halls with the same determination I had carried when I left with one suitcase 5 years earlier. Some were first-generation college students studying engineering or computer science. Others were aspiring entrepreneurs with ideas for small businesses that could serve their communities. The building itself had been transformed too. The ground floor still housed a jewelry store, but now it was a training center where foundation scholarship recipients learned retail management and customer service skills. The second floor had become a co-working space for young entrepreneurs, and the third floor housed our foundation offices, where Sophie and our growing staff developed new programs. I often thought about Margaret during quiet evenings in the penthouse, wondering if she would be proud of what her inheritance had become. I believe she would approve of how her money was being used to create opportunities, rather than simply preserve wealth. The foundation operated on the principle she had lived by, that true success meant lifting others up along the way. The family that had once called me mold now watched from a respectful distance as I bloomed into exactly the person Margaret had always believed I could become. Their attempts to diminish me had only made me stronger, and their efforts to exclude me from the family legacy had given me the motivation to create something far more meaningful than they had ever imagined. On quiet Sunday mornings, I would sit in Margaret's favorite chair with my coffee and remember her voice telling me stories about building her business from nothing. She had understood that the greatest inheritance wasn't money or property. It was the courage to become better than those who came before you, and the wisdom to use your success to create opportunities for others. The foundation's motto, carved into the marble wall of our main office, captured everything Margaret had taught me about legacy and purpose. True wealth isn't what you inherit, it's what you build, what you give, and how you choose to treat people when you have the power to hurt them. Every day brought new reminders that the greatest revenge against those who try to diminish you isn't destroying them, it's succeeding so completely that their opinions become irrelevant, while using that success to create a better world for the next generation. Margaret's legacy lived on not in the jewelry or antiques or real estate she had accumulated, but in the young lives being transformed by opportunity and mentorship. The woman who had started with a single jewelry shop and built an empire would have been proud to see her granddaughter building something even more valuable, a foundation that would create successful entrepreneurs and community leaders for generations to come. As the sun set over Lake Michigan on another peaceful evening in the penthouse, I felt the deep satisfaction that comes from turning pain into purpose, betrayal into wisdom, and exclusion into the motivation to create inclusion for others. The family that had tried to erase me from Margaret's story had unknowingly given me the greatest gift possible, the determination to write a story of my own that would matter far more than anything they had ever imagined. What do you think? Have you ever experienced a situation where family members underestimated your potential or tried to exclude you from something that was rightfully yours? How did you handle it, and what did it teach you about standing up for yourself while still maintaining your integrity? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. If this story resonated with you and reminded you that sometimes the best response to rejection is massive success that benefits others, please give this video a like to help more people discover it. Don't forget to subscribe for more stories about overcoming family drama and turning setbacks into comebacks. And share this with someone who might need a reminder that their worth isn't determined by how others treat them. Thank you for taking this journey with me today. And remember, your greatest legacy isn't what people leave you, but what you choose to leave behind for others. Until next time, keep believing in your own potential, even when others can't see it.